So I'm delighted to be here this morning. How many of you have ever heard me talk about the peak interview before? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so you're going to get almost nothing new. So if you go to sleep, you're forgiven. I do have one new thing. Some research has been done since I wrote the book, which is very helpful because it supports something in the book. At any rate, I wrote the peak interview about 7 years ago, and I wrote it for a completely different purpose. I didn't ever expect to be standing up in front of people who are in transition and talking about winning the job interview. The company that I was engaged with in those days, a little consulting company, one of the things we did is we helped our clients find the next competitive advantage. And we would do that in a day. It was a process we took a company through. We typically brought in a couple of people that are really good at this. We'd bring in the leadership team and usually 1 or 2 people from within the company that we picked out because they have certain talents. And we'd sit them in the room and we'd go through the process and we'd find the company's next competitive advantage, and we guaranteed it. It wasn't cheap, but we guaranteed it. If we didn't find your next competitive advantage, you didn't pay us. We never didn't get paid, so we were pretty good at this. But it's really hard to sell this product. First of all, people don't believe that you can do it in a day, and they want case studies. In our case studies, we have a couple that are really big. They're big Fortune 50 companies that really, what we found for them was so dead obvious, you can't believe they didn't see it, but they didn't. People get blinders on when they're working in an industry and they can't see the forest for the trees. The other examples tend to be either specific to a little industry or even specific to a particular company, and they're not really tangible. So we thought we need an example of how we can find competitive advantage where you wouldn't expect it to be easy to find. And so we got the whiteboard out, made a list of things, and on the list was the job interview. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. Because everybody who's our prospect understands the job interview, has been through it, typically on both sides of the table, and would appreciate finding new competitive advantage. So we put the job interview through the process, turned over a couple of stones where you wouldn't expect us to be able to turn over stones, and then wrote this little book. It was going to be a business card handout. So I didn't even have it edited because I never expected anybody would actually read it, right? It just gives you credibility to have a book. And so one day I was sitting in, well, what happened is a woman in New Jersey somehow got her hands on the book. She read it and she sent me back this package. And in the package she had photocopied every page in the book and she had gone through the trouble of editing it. And what she said is, I really like the content of the book, but the writing is crap. Which was true. And she said, I can't help myself, but I had to edit it. So she edited the whole book and sent me the sheets. And I put it aside for about 4 months. And then I was sitting in Starbucks and I was going to revise the book. And a friend of mine comes walking in. And it was a guy that I had been in Indian Guides with. And he was on the phone. He got off the phone. He came over. We had a little chit chat. He looks down. He says, what are you working on? And so I told him, I wrote this, excuse me, getting over a cold. I wrote this little book called The Peak Interview, and I'm just revising it. And he said, well, tell me about it. And so I did. And he said, listen, I run the chapel's employment ministry, and I was just on the phone with our speaker for Monday. And this was Friday. He said, and he canceled on me. Do you think that you could put together a handful of slides and talk to the group about your book? And I thought, sure, why not? So I did. And it seemed to go well. A week later, the phone rings. It's a community group in Lake Forest. They want to know if I can come and talk to their group, which I did. And that was about 7 years ago, and it hasn't stopped ringing since. So I'm very happy that Kathy invited me to speak here. Anyway, so that's a little background of the book. I always start with this slide. This is a list that I got from Robert Galvin. I had the chance to meet Robert Galvin and chat with him briefly. Anybody know who Robert Galvin was? Who was Robert Galvin?
Motorola's founder?
He wasn't actually the founder. His father founded the company. Robert Galvin was the CEO of Motorola, though, for about 30 some years. Back in the days when Motorola was Apple. It was the most innovative company in the world, a leader in many respects. Galvin was a loved CEO by the people that worked in Motorola. He was a walk-around kind of a guy, very open to people's ideas and thoughts and so on. And he gave me this list. And he said, this is a list that you frequently hear in companies. I certainly heard these kinds of phrases in my career. Things like, we can't do everything, right? And you'd hear that just before they would say, and the thing that you want to do? Sorry, can't do that, right? We can only afford so many new projects. Our market share is pretty good. There's only so many good people, and we'll always have projects on our cutoff list. Galvin said, those are things that you hear from managers. That's not what leaders say. What leaders say is, instead of we can't do everything, how can we do everything, right? How can we do everything? And his point was, you still wouldn't do everything, right? Because you simply can't. But if you start by saying, how can we do everything, you're going to do more things than you start with a roadblock statement like, we can't do everything, right? So how can we finance every project? How do we fulfill every customer? And his favorite was this one. They're all good people. Let's make them great. And he was right about that. And there's some marvelous books out there that talk about people who take over an organization as it is, a failing, kind of a wretched place, and turn it into an outstanding place to work. One of my favorite is Turn the Ship Around. And if you haven't read that, that's a great book about leadership. A captain of a Navy nuclear submarine took over the worst ship in the Navy with the worst crew in the Navy, didn't change a single sailor, took it as it was, and turned it in less than a year into the best ship in the Navy, best crew in the Navy. So it's about leadership. And then there'll always be projects on our cutoff list. Again, how can we do everything? The reason that I show you this is because as you listen to what I'm going to talk about in the peak interview, I don't want you to sort of walk out of here and say, that's not for me. Instead, sleep on it. And then when you wake up in the morning, ask yourself this question: how can I take something that Bill talked about and apply it to my job search? And I think if you do it that way, you'll probably be able to get more benefit out of it. At any rate, that's why I give you that list. So this is, I always tell this story. It's my recruiting story. This is a true story. It happened a few years ago to me. I was working out in San Francisco for a bank, happily employed, actually having a lot of fun in this job. And I got a call from a recruiter, and typically I was getting calls every week from recruiters, and I always took those calls because you never know what's out there, what might be interesting for your next step. And so he talked to me about a job in the Midwest, and he said, listen, it's right up your alley in terms of your experience. It's got an international component. I know you've got international in your background. Would you be interested in talking to me? I said, sure. So we scheduled a phone interview. We did that about a week later. This was the middle of August. And at the end of the phone interview, which seemed to go fine, he said, listen, I'm going to be putting names forward to the hiring company in a few days. And if they have any interest, they will contact you directly. I said, great, sure. So a week goes by, 2 weeks go by, a month goes by. And by now, I'm busy working, so I've kind of forgotten about this thing. And I hadn't heard from the company. And the phone rings. And it's the recruiter again. And he says, listen, Bill, just wanted to check in with you. We've had a little delay in this job. I'm now going to be putting names forward. And just wanted to check to make sure you're still interested. I said, sure. And so he said, well, they'll call you directly. So a week goes by, 2 weeks go by, a month goes by. Hadn't heard anything. Again, kind of forgotten about it. Phone rings. Same exact conversation that we had a month ago. Been a delay. Are you still interested? Sure. So a week goes by, 2 weeks go by. I get laid off. Big surprise. Just out of the blue, walked in one day, clean out your desk, you're gone, right? And it was the first time that ever happened to me. And the first time that it happens to you, of course, it's pretty devastating, right? So, you go through all that soul searching. What did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? What's to learn from this? Well, at any rate, I jumped right into my job search and got busy doing it. This was now the middle of October. So Halloween came and went, Thanksgiving came and went, Christmas came and went. And between Christmas and New Year's, the phone rings. Now I've got a couple of good opportunities on the table. I've got a job in Philadelphia working for a bank there and a job in Seattle working for a bank. Those are both the offers that are on the table, and they're not perfect, but I'm thinking about them. Now it's been 3 or 4 months that I've been out of work, so my runway's running out. Anyway, so it's the recruiter, and he says, listen, Bill, just wanted to check in with you. There's been a delay in the job, right? You're in the top 6 or 7 for this job, and I wanted to see if you're still interested because I'll be putting names forward at the beginning of the new fiscal year, which starts January 1st. But the real reason that I'm calling you is because I'm coming out to San Francisco on another search assignment, and I thought I'd take advantage of that to sit down with you in a face-to-face interview if you're open to that. And I thought top 6 or 7, he's probably going to be putting 2, 3 names forward at most. Where does that put me? Well, if you're in the top 6 or 7, what does it mean? It means you're number 7, right? And I thought, well, I'm probably not going to make it, into his short list, but he's a very well-known executive recruiter, and actually I won't give you his name because some of you probably know him. And I thought this would be good experience in getting an interview from him. So I said, sure. So we arranged to meet very early in the morning at the Compton Inn Hotel, which is just off Union Square in San Francisco. Sort of an interesting boutique hotel. In those days, a very different sort of clientele. And it was very early in the morning because he had a full day. So I meet him, we go into the coffee shop, we sit down, we're the only 2 people in the coffee shop. A little chit chat, we order waffles, they come. He starts the interview. Gets about 3 questions into the interview, and into the room walks Gene Hackman with his girlfriend. And they choose the table right behind me with her sitting back to back to me with Gene Hackman facing the recruiter, who leans forward and whispers to me, I can't believe it. It's Gene Hackman. He's my favorite actor of all time. And then he starts to talk about Gene Hackman movies, and then movies in general. Turns out he's a big movie buff. And then at some point he remembers that he's there to do a job interview. So he gets back to asking me interview questions, but every time he asks me a question, his eyes leave mine and they drift over my shoulder, and he's checking out Gene Hackman. And I think to myself, this is a complete waste of time, right? He's not listening to, he's not even hearing me. So, well, he gets about 3 questions into it, and he glances at his watch and he goes, we're out of time, right? And so we stand up and we go over to Gene Hackman's table because he wanted to meet Mr. Hackman. And to his credit, Gene Hackman was very gracious. He said, what are you doing in San Francisco? A little chit chat. The recruiter and I go to the door. He shakes my hand. He says, I'll be putting names forward to the hiring company. If they have any interest, they'll contact you directly. Well, lo and behold, the hiring company called me up, flew me out to Chicago. And the reason that we live in Chicago today is because I took that job. It was a great job. One of the best jobs anybody could ever have. And it turns out that I was the only candidate that the recruiter put forward because the interview was so spectacular, right?
Thanks, Gene.
Exactly, thanks, Gene. It was a peak interview, and you'll understand by the end of this why it was a peak interview. And that's the reason that we live in Chicago today. Okay, so how many of you in the room are salespeople? All right, okay. So a few of you raise your hands. It's kind of a trick question, right? Because you're in the job search. So how many of you are salespeople? You're all salespeople, right? So if you're salespeople in this role, what's the product? Yourselves? Right? That's sort of true, right? That's part true. And we'll explore that just a little bit because that's relevant to how you approach the job interview. The way that we do our competitive advantage study is we sort of take a step back and look sort of at the most broad picture that we can, and then that allows us to zoom in on what really matters. So when we did the excuse me, we did the job interview piece, we said, look, this is fundamentally a sale. It's a face-to-face sales environment. So what's going on in that circumstances? And so we wanted to take a look at sales. And so we looked at sort of the history of sales. We were going to compare the history of sales to the history of the job interview. And then back, if you go 70 years back, the sale was all about the close. How do we get to the close, right? And then some salespeople recognize that it's more than that. It's actually a buy experience. You want to get the buyer to do their job, which is to buy. And then people who were doing B2B transactions recognize that you've got to solve a problem. And the problem that you've got to solve, there's actually 2 problems in a B2B transaction. One is the problem for which the company put forward an RFP, right? The company's got a problem they want to solve, and so that's part of the issue. The other part is the problem of the purchasing manager, or the person who's making the decision to buy. And so imagine a company wants to buy a network router, right? A whole network solution. And so the the IT department and the purchasing department put together an RFP. The purchasing manager's going to make the decision based on the feedback from the returns to the RFP. And they get a return from Cisco and one from Tunson in Korea and a company in Latvia. Right? And going through that, turns out that the Korean company's response is absolutely perfect to the RFP. So which network router does the purchasing manager buy? Anybody know? Well, Cisco has 60% of the market. It's a brand name that the CEO and the rest of the leadership team is going to recognize. So if something goes wrong with the router after it's purchased, and he bought the Korean one that nobody's heard of, whose fault is it? Well, it's his fault, right? If he buys Cisco and something goes wrong with it, whose fault is it? Cisco's, right? So he's going to choose Cisco because that takes the risk out of it for him. There's two problems. In the job interview, you've got the same issue. It's a B2B transaction, and there are two issues, right? So that was informative to us. And then lastly, really astute salespeople recognize that it's always about the relationship. In a sale environment, it's always about the relationship. And to the extent that you can manage that relationship, great. Then we looked at product development. And product development in the last 70 years has changed a lot more than sales has. If you go back 70 years, it was all about features and price. Features when the economy's good, price when the economy's not so good. Then some psychologists got involved in the 1940s, and they said, look, it's not really about features and price. It's really about the benefits that those lead to. And so really you ought to be touting the benefits. And so that's where that started. And then in the 50s, television came into its own, started to really blossom. And it turns out that television is a really great way to get at many people, right? And so this concept, but it's expensive. So this concept of brand came into play because you could put a bunch of products under a brand umbrella, advertise the brand, and that sort of flows down through the products, and therefore you get more leverage out of it. And so this whole concept of brand really took hold in the 50s and 60s. And then when you get into the 70s and 80s and 90s, this whole niche marketing concept really took hold because you discovered that you could tailor your product offering to a particular group and tout the benefits for that particular group and take more of that smaller market share, but then dominate it in smaller groups. It probably culminated in the 1990s with Dell Computer. Because Dell Computer, what would happen with Dell is you'd call them up on the phone and you'd order your computer. And you'd order the disk drive. Remember when we used to have disk drives? It would slide out and you could put your coffee onto it, right? Modems, remember when you order your modem, what speed modem do you want? So you'd specify the hardware that would go into your computer, then the software that would go with it, and overnight, Dell would build your unique one-off computer, get it loaded with all the software, and ship it to you in the morning. You were a niche of one. And that's sort of where it culminated. Then in the 90s, the psychologists got back involved. And they said, there's other ways to approach customers. And one of them is to do an identity play, which is you link your product to a particular aspect of identity that is desirable for people. And it gets reflected in many different ways. I was a banker, and I traveled the world. We all wore Hermes ties. It was part of our identity. I drove a Volvo station wagon because I was a father, and I wanted to be seen as a responsible, caring father for my children, and the Volvo was a very safe car, right? And in fact, we did have an accident in one of our Volvos. I got sandwiched between two trucks. Both trucks were undrivable, but I drove away in that Volvo. And so they lived up to their name. At any rate, so there was an identity play. And then even later in the 2000s, the psychologists said there's something even deeper that you can tap into, which is meaning. You can create meaning for customers. And in fact, lots of products do that. Is anybody familiar with Tom's shoes? So when you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, what happens?
They send another one in part of the world.
That's right. They send a pair of shoes to a child somewhere in the world who's in need of shoes. And the reason that Tom's Shoes started doing this is because the owner of Tom's Shoes had a previous company. And he sold that company and had a whole bunch of money. And he went traveling. And he was down in Argentina, out in the Pampas, and they were visiting a village, and there was a lot of sickness in the village. And so he was talking to the person that was taking him around and said, well, what's causing all this sickness? And says, well, there's all sorts of germs and so on that kids come in contact with. And the problem is they're barefoot, and they're walking around in the dirt, and that's how they get all these ailments. And he said, well, why don't they have shoes? Well, because they can't afford them. And so he thought, well, I can put shoes on these kids. And then he got out a napkin, and he was doing the calculation on how many pairs of shoes he could buy to put on kids around the world. And it wasn't a large number compared to the number of kids. So he thought, how can I do this at scale? And he came up with this idea for Tom's shoes, that when you buy a pair of shoes, baked into the price that you pay is a price for a second pair of very inexpensive shoes that will go to kids in the third world. So that when you buy a pair of shoes, you become a philanthropist. You're helping some poor kid somewhere in the world. And it creates meaning for you in the purchase. Another company that does this is Method Cleaning Products. And I always check the kitchen counter before I leave the house, because when I first married my wife, she kept the kitchen counter completely bare. There was absolutely nothing on the kitchen counter. And then one year I bought her a KitchenAid mixer because she loves to bake, and this was sort of, in those days, the premium mixer, and that went on the counter. And then I bought her a nice set of knives and one of those blocks that you put the knives in. We still have that. That's still on the counter. And she put that on the counter, but nothing else. Then one day I noticed there's this bottle of cleaning dish soap on the counter, and I look at it. It's Method, right? Now, why did she put Method on the counter? Well, it turns out that Method creates meaning for her. She feels very responsible for the health and well-being of the family, and what Method does is Method makes their products so they're completely non-toxic. You could actually take that dish soap and squirt it in your mouth. It won't hurt you. It won't taste very good, but it won't hurt you. In addition, so it's completely biodegradable. Everything that in the packaging is completely either recyclable or biodegradable, so no impact on the community. So no impact on the environment, no impact on the community. And what's wonderful about these products is they work. They actually do what they're supposed to do. So when I left this morning, I checked the kitchen counter. There were two products on the kitchen counter. They're both Method products because they create meaning for my wife. So meaning is an important element of how people make decisions. So that's the I and the me there, identity and meaning. So we then looked at the job interview, and the job interview hasn't changed that much in the past 70 years. There have been a couple of changes that matter. One of the changes is that the behavioral event interview is now very common, right? And I'm sure you're all familiar with a behavioral event interview. It's where they'll ask you a question like, tell me about a time that you were faced with such and such situation, right? And what they're looking for you to reveal are competencies, because they can see your education and your experience and your skills based on your resume, right? Based on your LinkedIn profile. What they really want to know is, what are your competencies? What's your leadership ability? What's your teamwork play like? How do you communicate? These sorts of things. And that's what those behavioral event questions are designed to do, because they're very clever. They don't tell you what they're asking. They don't say, tell me about your leadership ability, right? They give you a situation, and if you're telling the story around that, answering that question, leadership emerges as part of the narrative, great. You know, check that one off. If not such a good thing, right? So it really pays to know what competencies are associated with whatever position you're pursuing. So how do you go about doing that? Well, one of the ways that you can go about doing that, and probably the best way, is to network into the company. You find somebody who works in the company and ask them about the position. What are they looking for? You know, what's the communication style? What's the teamwork? What's the leadership requirements? And so on. That's the best way to do it. Hard to do, though, right? It takes a lot of work to be able to network into a company where you don't already know somebody in the company. Another way to do it, if you can't do that, is to get a copy of the job description and then go through it line by line, and in the margin, write whatever competency might be relevant to that part of the job description. Now, the name of the company and the address, obviously you won't be writing anything, but if you do it line by line, at the end of it, what you do is you count up each instance of competency that you wrote down. And the ones that have the most instances are the ones that you definitely want to cover in the job interview because they will matter to the company. All right? So, interview is all about me, which isn't true. We know it's all about the company. So when we looked at the job interview, if you do the research into job interviews, you'll find it's completely overwhelming. There are hundreds of thousands of documents talking about the job interview, how it's structured, how it's broken down, how it's categorized, and so on. I chose just a very simple categorization, structured and unstructured. The structured interview typically is one where the company has a discipline around the job interview process in the belief that this will enable the company to pick the best candidate. And typically what happens is you'll go into an interview, you'll talk to several people, each person will have a set of questions they're going to ask. Every candidate gets those same questions in the same order, notes are taken. At the end of the process, the interviewers get together, they go through their notes, and this enables them ostensibly to pick the best candidate. Right? The unstructured interview is sort of just the opposite. There's no pre-planned set of questions. You go in, it's typically more of a conversation with the person that you're interviewing with. That's in a way a little bit to your advantage because it gives you the opportunity to show a little more personality. Right? It turns out that the structured interview is slightly better than the unstructured interview in terms of picking the best candidate for the job. But it's only slightly better. And it turns out that it's actually no better than just flipping a coin. If you took the people that are interviewing for the job, flipped a coin and let the coin choose who you hire, you'll do just as well as you do with a structured interview, which is pretty interesting. How do you discover that? Great accidents happen, and this was a wonderful accident that happened down in Texas. The University of Texas Medical School brings in about 100 new future doctors into the medical program every year. It's funded by the government in Texas. And they go through a rigorous process. They have faculty and admin people interview every single candidate. They go through about 2,500 applications. They pick 800 to interview. 800 of these kids get interviewed. They go through this whole process. There's a whole scoring mechanism they use, and it ranks all 800 from 1 to 800. They then send letters out to the first 250. And the reason they send it out to the first 250 is because typically the people that interview well in Texas also interview well at Emory, right, or other medical schools. And Texas often isn't the first choice. And so they know they have to go to about 250 to start filling those positions. Typically they get to about 350 before they've filled their 100 positions. So 1 year Texas does this. They fill their 100 positions. About 4 months later, the Texas legislature has a surplus. So they decide, we'll fund 50 additional doctor students. And so they authorize this. Well, now the school has to go out and find additional 50 students. Well, when they get to that list, they ended up finding nobody who's lower than a 700 who will accept it. And they fill those 50 positions from the dregs of the interview process, right? But they were smart. They didn't segregate those students from the first 100 in terms of what the faculty knew or even the administrators knew, but they did track them. And what they discovered was interesting. After the first 2 years of study, there was no difference in the two groups, exactly the same performance. When they went into the residency, exactly the same performance, and the same percent of students made it to being a doctor out of both groups. What it showed is their whole interview process was a complete waste of time. It was really a popularity contest more than anything else. Even though it was very rigorous, it really had no additional value, and it was very expensive. So did they stop doing it? Of course not. Of course not. So what are better ways to do it? One is the work demo. And Method actually uses a work demo. They'll interview somebody, and they recognize it's a popularity contest, but they'll hire somebody they like because they're going to work with this person. They might as well like them, right? They don't have a job for them. They bring them in, they let them work for, sort of roam around for a couple of weeks, getting to meet all kinds of people, doing some work. And then after 2 weeks, if they still like them, they find a job for them. Now this was a growing, startup kind of a company, so it was a different kind of an environment than many companies, but it was an opportunity to see how somebody actually operated in the company. Really kind of the best way to hire somebody. If you can't do that, and by the way, if the job lends it to do that, do it. Take a lumberjack. I was actually a lumberjack very early in my career when I was about 18 years old. The lumberjack, by the way, is the most dangerous job in the United States. But if you want to know somebody is a good lumberjack, what you do is you take them to a tree, give them a chainsaw, and say, take down that tree, and tell me where the tip of that tree is going to land. And a good lumberjack will be able to tell you within about 4 feet exactly where the tip of that tree is going to land. Then if you really want to test them, ask them to hand sharpen the chainsaw, because that's a real art. And either you know what you're doing or you don't. So at any rate, that's a work demo. If you can't do that, hire a smart, honest person. Give them an integrity test, give them an IQ test. If you hire somebody who's smart and honest, you'll do pretty well. So what's really going on in the job interview? So what's really going on in the job interview is you hear this thing around fit. We want to hire somebody who fits. It's sort of a euphemism for we want to hire somebody we like, because that's what it really comes down to. The hiring manager ultimately will hire the person they like the best. That's what the data shows, and we know that to be true. That's the mechanism for making the selection. So if you want the job, be the person the hiring manager likes the best. It's that easy. So I can stop here, right? No. So we said, okay, how do you do that? How do you become the person the hiring manager likes the best? And that causes us to then look into what's getting in the way. And what gets in the way is bias. Bias is a huge problem. And it's always there. We all have it, and we use it for every decision we make. We're unaware of our own biases. We can't see them. Other people who are different from us typically can see them. People who are just like us typically don't see our biases because they share them. But bias really invades all the decisions we make. And one of the best examples is this symphonic audition. And the example of it is an American woman was quite keen to work at a very famous German orchestra. And at the time, she was probably the best musician in the world in her instrument. And so she went over, they had an opening in her instrument, so she went over and auditioned for them. This was many years ago. Typically you play a piece that you've prepared and they may throw one at you that you have to play. She played, and brilliantly. She just thought it was perfect. And very convinced that they would have her back. But when the callback sheet came out, her name wasn't on it. And she was looking at the list, and she noticed that almost every name on the list was male. That there had been other females that had auditioned, but they weren't on the list. And then she started doing a little research, and she discovered that was true. When about half the people auditioning were women in the initial audition, the callback sheet, less than 10% were women. And so she sued them for gender bias. They fought her. They fought her for 18 years. But she was tenacious and ultimately won her suit. But what happened is other orchestras looked at this and said, she's absolutely right about this. I mean, look at what we do. This is exactly what we do. We have to fix it. Anybody know how they fixed it? A curtain, exactly, a blind audition. So in a blind audition, you come out, typically in stocking feet, so there's no telltale footfall. You're not allowed to cough, sneeze, clear your throat, talk, or do anything that's going to reveal anything about you. And you're going to play behind this screen so that the panel, which is typically the conductor, the music director, some trustee in the village, somebody from the university, maybe a couple of musicians, they're going to listen to you play, and they're going to select the person who plays the instrument the best. It turns out that when you put a curtain up, half the people are female in the initial audition. Guess what happens on the callback sheet? Half the people are female, right? Takes the bias right out of the equation. So some psychologists were quite interested in this, and this was developing. So they talked to people who were still doing the non-curtained audition and asked them about this question about bias. Are you biased towards male musicians? No. We just listen to the quality of the music. Well, then why is there a preponderance of males in the callback sheet? Well, it's because males are bigger, they're stronger, they have better endurance, right? They can play the instrument with more power. That was one reason, which of course is complete nonsense. The other reason was Men play the instrument for the love of the music. Women play it for technical reasons, right? These were the reasons that the panel gave. Complete and utter nonsense, because the minute you put up the curtain, you couldn't tell the gender of the person, right? Took the bias right out of the equation. The trouble is, in the face-to-face interview, it's harder to take the bias out of the equation. But you still want to do that. That led us to Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is anybody know who he is? So Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist. He teaches at Princeton. He's very well known. He's actually Israeli. He's written a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And I encourage anybody to read that book. If you want sort of modern behavioral economics and psychology in one volume that's quite readable, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is sort of the short course on modern psychology. He happens also to be the first psychologist who has never studied economics at all to win the Nobel Prize in economics. And he's really the father of behavioral economics. He studied bias, among the other things that he studied. And he was instrumental sort of in how do we tackle this issue. So what you want to do is you want to create a strategy going into the job interview. And I'm going to talk about creating peaks in the interview in a moment. But what you want to do is have a perfect baseline strategy, because that gives you a nice platform to lift peaks off of. Now, peaks can be positive or negative, and that's why this good baseline helps. You don't want any negative peaks, right? So how do you create that perfect baseline? Well, the good news, it's all the stuff that you're already doing, right, in the job, in your preparation for the job interview, which is you do an inventory. You probably can't read this. Your interests, your passions, your values, and so on. Your abilities in an inventory, competencies, the ideal job description, a list of people in your network, of course, your elevator speech, your 2-minute commercial, your handbill. Handbill being, of course, probably the most useful thing that you've got in terms of networking, because as you network, people want to help you. Right? And if I say, hey, listen, I need some help, I want to find mid-sized companies that can use some help with sales, right? You want to help me, but it's not very specific. But if I came to you with a list of 20 companies and said, listen, these are the companies I'd really like to talk to, and you look at it and say, oh, my neighbor actually works for that company. You now have an avenue to help somebody. And everybody wants to help you. It's just hard to do. And by having a handbill with a list of companies on it, you make it easy for that person to help you. So very valuable. Resume, cover letter, stories. Stories around your accomplishments, things that you've done, problems that you've solved, and then stories around your strengths and weaknesses. Those are very useful to have in your back pocket, and I'll talk just a little bit more about stories in a moment. So, prepare for the behavioral event interview. And if you prepare for the behavioral event interview, then you'll really be prepared for any interview. And you're likely to run into that. At your level and in your profession, you're likely to find that's what you'll run into. So prepare for it. There's lots of sets of questions and answers out on the internet that you can tap into to get some ideas from. This is the 64 toughest interview questions. It's a list of questions and then suggested answers. If you use this list, there's probably 2 answers out of the 64 that are pretty good. The rest of them you've got to do better than. You know, sort of take it as your most incompetent competition will give those answers. You're going to do better. So it's a good thing to sort of practice, think ahead of these things. If you guys are in any accountability groups, bounce sort of oddball questions off one another occasionally, and that gives you an opportunity to answer a question in a non-consequential environment, which is useful to do. So anyway, going to prepare that way. Stories. Stories play a very important role in the job interview. Because what they do is they allow you to reveal a competence in a way that's very credible. So if you think about, are you a good leader? I'm a good leader, right? Anybody can say I'm a good leader. It's not a very credible statement. What you want to convey to the hiring manager is credibility. And what a story does, it allows you to create that credibility without ever making the claim. So you never, in a story, have to say, I'm a great leader, because in the narrative of the story, the narrative is going to reveal you as a leader. So I encourage you to craft a bunch of stories, have them in your back pocket. You don't know what story you're going to use when you go into the job interview, but having stories that you've worked through, that you know how you're going to tell, is very helpful. And stories should be structured in a way that causes them to be memorable. And Chip and Dan Heath wrote a book called Made to Stick. Made to Stick is about how you craft a memorable message, and this model comes from their book. The model is success, S-U-C-C-E-S. So the first S is simple. So you definitely want your story to be simple. And that means you can tell it in probably 2 or 3 minutes. It should be focused. Don't put a whole bunch of stuff in one story. You want one thing to emerge out of the story, which is the competency that you want to reveal. Unexpectedness, I'll come back to. Concrete. So when you craft a story, if you can put something in it that's concrete. You know, we walked out onto the factory floor and they were cooking something delicious and the air was just full of this marvelous smell, right? You've now pulled your audience into the factory. They're now with you. And to the extent that you can get whoever's listening to your story in with you, you've now created a more impactful story. Credible, obviously, you want it to be credible. Over the years, I've heard some people's stories. I do a workshop on stories. And some of the stories are incredible, you know. But you've got to tell an incredible story credibly, right? You can still tell it, but you've got to tell it credibly. It's got to be believable. You definitely don't want the hiring manager to think you're making something up, right? Emotional. If you could tell a story that's emotional, terrific. Make sure the person who's tearing up isn't you, right? You don't want to get emotional over your own story. Not that important in a job interview to have an emotional story, but if you can do it, great. Emotion is important in the decision-making process because it turns out the choices that we make are made in the same place in the brain where emotions happen and decisions happen. They're in the same place. And we want to tap into that part of the brain. So emotions are good for that, but not that critical in the job interview. We're going to deal with that a little differently. And then stories. And short should also be the other S. So you could add 2 S's on the end of the acronym. So coming back to unexpectedness. Unexpectedness is the juice in the story. If you think about why we like a magic trick, right? We like a magic trick because we know something surprising is happening at the end. We like a joke because we know something unexpected is happening at the end. For some reason, the human brain loves this. And we love stories where there's something unexpected at the end. Now, the trick with unexpectedness is it can't actually be too unexpected. So if I tell you a story, it's a murder mystery, and Jim, Jane, and Jerome are the 3 most likely suspects. And we're going through the story, and at the very end, I reveal that the murderer was actually an alien that flew down from Mars, right? Very unsatisfactory, because this hadn't come up in the story anyplace else. You were expecting it to be one of these 3 characters. Unsatisfactory. Unexpectedness can't actually be completely unexpected. It's got to be something that somebody could have sort of thought through. Because what happens, what makes unexpectedness powerful in a story, is that after the fact, the listener will go, I actually knew that's how it was going to turn out. Even though they really know they didn't know how it was going to turn out, it's sort of a weird psychological phenomenon. It makes the story richer for the listener. So you want to bake in unexpectedness. It turns out it's pretty easy to do. You have to think it through. What's your greatest weakness? So this is my what's your greatest, I'm not going to tell you the story, I'm going to tell you the lead to the story. So I was in banking, right? So this is my greatest weakness. I know it doesn't sound like it has anything to do with banking, but it turns out it did. My biggest weakness is ice cream, right? So now I've set up the story. You want to know how is ice cream relevant to this banker in terms of his weakness? Now, it doesn't at all answer this question, but let's face it, this is a stupid question, right? Nobody's going to say, you know, when I drink, I gamble, right? All right. So perfect baseline interview, prepare for the behavioral event interview, have about a dozen stories. When I go out on a sales call for the product that I sell, I now have, I don't actually know how many, but about 50 stories. And I never know, walking in the door, what stories I'm going to use in that call. But I always use stories, and they're always the right thing at the right moment to get something across that I'm later going to use. And then practice, practice, practice. If you do nothing else for preparing for the job interview, practice, 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 because that's what gets you comfortable at answering these questions, gets you skilled at answering the questions, and gives you more confidence walking into the interview. And believe it or not, of course, being confident in the interview is one of the most endearing things that you can do to cause the hiring manager to like you. All right, peaks. So Daniel Kahneman came up with a theory. So he wrote the prospect theory with Amos Tversky. That's what that's caused him to win the Nobel Prize. Later on, he came up with another theory called the peak end rule. The peak end rule says this: there are certain experiences that we have that are episodic in nature, that have a defined beginning, a defined end, a consistent middle, and the way the brain evaluates these episodic experiences is based on the peaks during the experience and how it ends, with the ending being the most important. This is the peak end rule. It's become, you'll now run across this rule in lots of things. In fact, Chip and Dan Heath, who wrote the book Made to Stick, just wrote a new book, and it came out 3 or 4 months ago. It's about moments, and it starts out with the peak end rule. That's what they talk about. It's a good book. It's not as good as Made to Stick, but it's a good book, and you can read that one as well. What this says is that there are peaks during an experience, with the end being the most important peak. And if you want the brain to evaluate an experience as good, you want good positive peaks. If you want it to be a bad experience, have negative peaks. So positive or negative peaks can happen. In the job interview, obviously, you'd only want positive peaks. It turns out job interview is that episodic experience, right? It has a defined beginning, a defined ending, and a very consistent middle. There are other things that are not that way. Take your day, right? 2 of 3 criteria are met. Defined beginning, you wake up. Defined end, you go to sleep, right? But the middle is not consistent at all. There's lots of variability in the middle of your day, and your brain won't evaluate your day using that same peak end rule. But a job interview, that's exactly how your brain, the hiring manager's brain, will evaluate the experience. Well, that's very informative, because if we can create peaks during the interview, then we put ourselves in the position of giving the hiring manager a great experience, which is what we want to do if we want to be likable. So we thought, how are we going to create those peaks? Well, at first, the idea was, well, we'll tell great stories, which is a little bit of a problem, because being a great storyteller takes a lot of work and a lot of practice. But we thought, well, that's an option. So we started to look into the research around peaks and what's going on when somebody experiences a peak. There wasn't a ton of research, but there was enough. One of the things that we came across is that the degree to which a peak is effective, the impact of a peak, depends on how active the brain is. We thought, okay, well, that's interesting. You want to activate the emotional centers of the brain. You want to get the brain nice and active. And then I ran across a study that had actually done fMRI work when a person is talking. This is a little critical, because you can't talk without moving your jaw muscle, right? And moving in your throat. And an MRI is based on you sitting still, right? Being still. But they figured out a way to do this, which was fairly clever. At any rate, they did an fMRI while people are talking, when they're listening. Turns out the brain's 4 times more active when you're talking than when you're listening. There's a lot more going on. We thought, well, that's a real monkey wrench, because now we've got to create the peak when the hiring manager's doing the talking. How do we do that? Well, you do that by asking questions and getting the hiring manager to answer. And you want to ask a question in a particular way that causes a peak to happen. That then led us into further research. So, answers make the heart grow fonder. Ask a question of the hiring manager and get them to create a peak while they're doing the talking. So, the first question, we're going to do 3 questions in the job interview. This is the first one. So 20 minutes into the interview. So what's happening 20 minutes into the interview? Say it's an hour-long interview. What's going on? Who's doing what?
Talking about yourself, you're pretty much.
Why are you talking about yourself?
To get to know, so they get to know you.
Right. But you're actually answering the hiring manager's questions, right? Right. So typically 20 minutes into the interview, it's the hiring manager that's still asking questions. You're answering questions. So if you want to create a peak by asking a question, you have to ask permission to ask a question, right? So you'll get a question, you'll go, love to answer that question. If you don't mind, after I do, I've got a question of my own I'd like to ask. Now, if the hiring manager's got a rigid script that they're going to follow, they might say, no, I've got to ask you some questions. You'll have plenty of time at the end of the interview to ask your questions, which is the first lie you'll ever hear from the company, right? Because you won't get that much time. Typically, they ask questions right up to close to the end of the interview. But if you get permission, which can happen, anybody who's done a bunch of interviewing knows it gets really tedious after a while. After you get to about the third candidate, you're getting these pat answers. It's just not an enjoyable experience. It's kind of boring. Any break in the monotony is welcome, and so you say, yes, sure, go ahead and ask your question. If you get permission, then you ask a question similar to this one, make it your own, right? This is your interview, make the question your own. But this is the question. So remember I talked about two problems in the sale for a B2B transaction? So you got two problems that you've got to address in the job interview. One is the reason the company has the open position, right? And the other is whatever issue the hiring manager's got. Now, you don't know what the issue is that the hiring manager's got. So all you can do is assume that the environment of the company is one like any other company where most things work pretty well, but there's always these little conflicts in the company, things that don't work great, right? Things that could go better. So this question really is around, I think, the first problem. So I'm very interested in how an individual can make a difference in the workplace. If I were the ideal candidate for this position with exactly the right skills, competencies, abilities, personality, etc., what could I do or help to do that would make a positive difference perhaps in your department or in the company as a whole? So, you know, sales and marketing don't really get along that well, right? So maybe you could do something to help solve that problem. Now, if the hiring manager answers this question, great, but there's a fair chance that the hiring manager will be stumped by this question, won't have an answer right away. And if you preface it with something like, you know, this is something I've always liked to do, says, well, if you've always liked to do it, give me an example of where you've done it. Have a story ready. Have a story ready that reveals a competency that you've identified as being important for this role, right? Because the chances are about 50-50 or greater that you'll get to tell a story after you ask this question. All right, so what is it about this question that makes it work? This question is a counterfactual hypothetical. Counterfactual, right? Not true, at least not true yet. And hypothetical, what if, right? What if I were the ideal candidate? What could I do to make the company better, right? The power of the counterfactual hypothetical is really interesting. This is something that came out of all the psychological research. If you want to be influential in the hiring manager's brain, a counterfactual hypothetical is a wonderful pathway to that influence. And the way this was studied is scientists, and they've done different kinds of studies, but this is an example of one. They had some, and if you read psychological studies, you'll discover that almost all of the experiments are done with undergraduate and graduate school students at universities because they're sort of the ready population that will participate in these studies. And they'll do it for class credit, they'll do it for some tiny amount of money. So when you read them, they're all about students. So a bunch of students came into a room and they said to the students, listen, we're going to take you into another room. We've got a whole bunch of stuff that we want you to do. We're doing a set of psychological studies. We're going to observe you. And afterwards, we're going to take you into a debrief room and talk to you about the studies in the debrief room. So both the control group and the test group got that much of the conversation. Then the test group got this further conversation. Listen, we're not quite ready to go into the other room, so we're going to wait for a few minutes. You know, while we're waiting, I just have a question. This occurred to me. Imagine that you read in the New England Journal of Medicine that it turns out that because of the ingredients that go into cake and the way cake is prepared, it turns out that cake is far more nutritious than we ever thought it was. Now, this isn't true, but imagine that you read this in the New England Journal of Medicine. How would that change your cake eating habits? And the person would go around the room and get feedback from various people. They then went and they did the sort of the dummy work, which was to distract people from this initial counterfactual hypothetical. And then they took them, and as they walked down the hall, they were allowed to pick a snack. And on the table were bowls of fruit salad and a beautiful chocolate cake, all sliced up with a cherry on each piece. Well, the control group went through, and guess what they picked to eat? Fruit, exactly. The majority of them picked fruit. The test group went through, guess what they picked? Cake, right? And so the debrief was all about, we noticed that you picked cake, and we had talked about cake being, more nutritious. Did you think that was true? 100% of the people, and there were about 600 students who went through this, 100% of them said, no, we knew it wasn't true. It was just a what if, Then why did you pick cake? I don't know. Just felt like having cake. It turns out that just by having that conversation about cake changed their interest in having cake. Now, they've done this study with all kinds of different decisions, and it always turns out to be true. The impact of asking a counterfactual hypothetical question is profound in influencing people's subsequent choices. And what they then did is they went to find out what makes it profound. And it turns out that two things, and I won't take you through the experiments that reveal this, but two things. One is how relevant the question is to the person that has to answer it. And two is how much they have to elaborate when they answer the question. Right? So we want to ask questions that are both very relevant and require elaboration. And we want to ask them in a way that puts us in a position of being in that role, so that that's how the hiring manager sees us. So 40 minutes into the interview, you're going to ask the question around, remember the personal problem? This is now the personal problem. It says, earlier I asked how the ideal candidate for a job could make the company better. Wherever I've worked, I've always been interested in helping my boss accomplish something special. If I were the ideal candidate, possessing exactly the right characteristics and so on, how might I be able to help you do something that you want to accomplish, something you're interested in doing? Now, this is a fair, you make it your own question, by the way. You word it your own way. What you're really tapping into is, in the workplace today, most people are really sort of overwhelmed. We've trimmed staff down to the point where everybody is both a manager and an individual contributor, so your time is really precious. Being able to pursue something extra, something special, is hard to do. So now the job candidate that you're talking to is offering to help you pursue something that you're very interested in doing. So if they answer the question, great. If they don't, they may throw it back at you. Tell me about a time that you were able to do this. Have a story ready. And the story shouldn't be something like, well, I got a call from my boss. She was at the airport. She had forgotten her dry cleaning. And so I ran to the dry cleaner and I got her dry cleaning and got it to the airport. Isn't it very nice that you did it for your boss, but not the kind of story that reveals some competency. You actually want a story that gets deep into a competency that matters for the job, right? Okay, so that takes us to, so we're going to create 3 peaks. The peak at the end, I'll get to in a moment. It is the single most important question you've got to ask in the job interview. The bonus question is the second most important question to ask in the job interview, but don't ask the bonus question and sacrifice the peak end question, right? Have the priorities right. So the bonus question is a counterfactual hypothetical, and you want it to be both relevant and require elaboration. And this is the question. Oh, and it's got to be about you. So remember, the other 2 questions were about you. What if I were the ideal candidate? You always want to make it about you. If you ask the question, tell me about what the ideal candidate would do, it's not about you. It has no power to influence the hiring manager about you. So this is the bonus question. There it is. Suppose you hired me. I just completed my first year. Imagine that my contribution has been extraordinary. What have I accomplished? Right? The candidate is asking the hiring manager what makes for outstanding performance. And any hiring manager worth their salt knows they have to answer this question. But they're unprepared. I mean, they've created the job description, but they haven't thought about what makes for outstanding performance. It's relevant, and they have to elaborate. They sort of have to make it up as you go along. what you want to do as the candidate is make sure they're answering the question that puts you in that role, right? Because when they do that, when they explain what makes for such an outstanding performance, and you're the one delivering it, at the conscious level, they know it's not true, right? It's a what if. At the subconscious level, at the non-conscious level, their brain begins to attribute to you the capability of delivering this level of performance. It has tremendous influence on their decision making because they've already put you in that successful role, right? All right, peak end. So we wanted to create a big peak at the end. And the research here wasn't that helpful. It just didn't give us a really clear place to go. So went to that eminent psychologist, Barbara Walters. Barbara Walters is a really gifted interviewer. And she wrote a book back in 1970 or something called How to Talk to Practically Anybody About Practically Anything. And this was back in the days, early in her career, she was on the Today Show. And she did the fluff human interest segment on the Today Show. So she wasn't on every day, but she was on reasonably frequently. And the Today Show would travel. They would go so they were based in New York. They would go to Philadelphia or Boston, and they'd do a remote show. But it was done live, so it was very early in the morning, and typically they'd be showing up in the studio at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to prepare for the show. So they would travel the night before, the afternoon before, and they would always get invited to cocktail parties. And they would go to them, and Hugh Downs, who was the Today Show host in those days, and whoever was the weatherman, they were very popular. Everybody knew them. And when they went to these parties, people would gather around them. Well, Barbara Walters wasn't very well known. Most people didn't know who she was, and she would mingle around the cocktail party sort of anonymously. Her gift, though, is to engage with somebody right away. And so what she would do is she'd walk up to somebody and she'd say, "Oh, very pleased to meet you." And very quickly, within the two minutes, she'd find out what your interests are and what you're passionate about, and then she'd ask you a question. And I use tomato growing. I grow tomatoes. I wish I had a really green thumb, but I don't. But imagine that the person that she's interviewing or talking to, tomato growing is their passion. She'll then ask a question. "Oh, I love tomatoes." "Oh, I absolutely love tomatoes. You must have grown, what's the best tomato you ever grew?" Right? And if that's your passion, you'll have a best tomato story. "Oh, there was this one year, the weather was incredibly good for tomato growing, and I grew some beefsteak." And so that you hear this whole story. And what Barbara Walters would do is she would encourage. She would say, "Oh, tell me more, tell me more." And after a few minutes of listening to the story, she would glance at her watch. She says, "You know, I am so glad I met you. I've learned so much about tomatoes, and I love tomatoes. Thank you so much. This was so great." And then she'd step off, right? That person she'd overhear that person go to the next group, and guess what that person would say? They would say, "I just met the most interesting woman," right? Even though she had said nothing. Her insight was that we love to talk about ourselves. And we all know that's true. We love talking about ourselves. And it creates a big peak for us. Well, since I wrote the peak interview, a couple of investigators at Harvard got interested in this question. What really is going on in the brain when we're talking about ourselves? And so they arranged a study using fMRI, got people to talk about themselves, monitoring brain activity, and then compared them to talking about other people. And what they discovered is, lo and behold, Barbara Walters was right. Our brain really fires in the emotional centers and in the pleasure centers when we're talking about ourselves, particularly if we're talking about something that we're proud of. So, this is the question. I'm keen to work in an environment where a person can make a real difference. In that line, I'd love it if you'd tell me about a time when working here you were able to do something special, something significant, something you're proud of. Right? Now, make it your own question. You don't have to ask it this way. Fundamentally, you want to say, "Look, it's been great talking to you. You're clearly an interesting person. Tell me about something that you've done that you're proud of." But you want to make sure that you don't leave it open so that they talk about their children. Because about 50% of women and about 25% of men will go right there. They'll talk about their kids, and that's great, but you don't want it. That's not really why you're asking this question. You want them to talk about something they've done, something they've accomplished. People typically will falter a little bit when you first ask the question, but they'll come up with a story. But more than 80% of the time they'll come up with a story, and very often more than one story. The rule of thumb on this question is that if it takes more than an hour to answer the question, which it occasionally does, you get the job 100% of the time. So encourage whoever you're talking to keep talking. Make sure that your calendar is free, because if your hiring manager is talking, you don't want to say, gee, I'd love to stay, but I got to run, right? Make sure this is the last thing you do in the interview. Remember, the theory, the peak end rule, says that it's the very end peak that matters, and you want this to be the end. So when this story is over, you're done. So if you have any housekeeping that you need to do it before you ask this question, right? What are the next steps? You know, should I call you? What should I do? You know, do all that in advance of asking this question. All right, so send a thank you note, obviously. Done with an interview, send a thank you note. In the thank you note, it's really simple. Say thank you. Express interest in the job, even if you're not interested. And the reason that I say that is you don't have an offer on the table, so you've got nothing to turn down. You may get an offer, and you may turn it down. But better to get the offer and turn it down than not, right? And I advise this also because you never know what's coming down the path. So I was working in San Francisco, and I was offered a job in Los Angeles. It was a promotion, and it would give me broader responsibility. So I was kind of interested from a career perspective in this role. We went down, my wife and I went down with our oldest kid, who was just a baby at the time, and we did a house hunting trip, right? Because I had already said I was interested in the job. About 2 hours into the house hunting trip, we're riding in the back seat of the realtor's car, and my wife leans over to me and she says, "There's no way in hell I'm living here." So I knew at that point that I was going to be turning down this job, right? Which I ultimately did. But I did it, you know, nicely. And 6 weeks later, the company came back, offered me a job in San Francisco that was a bigger responsibility than in fact, the job in Los Angeles that I would have taken ended up reporting to me in San Francisco. So you never know what's coming down the pike, what else might be there. So don't rule it out right off the bat, even if you end up not taking it. And then end the thank you note with, I'd love to hear more about whatever it is they talked about in answer to the peak end question, because it'll cause them to re-peak and re-remember you. And that's really what you want. You want them to remember you. So that's your thank you note. And that is almost the end here. So with any question that you're going to use in a job interview, don't wait to the job interview to ask it for the first time, right? You don't want it to come across as sort of artificial. You want it to come across as genuine. So I encourage you to use this question in your networking. Use it any place you get. So you're coming out of church or the synagogue or the mosque or the temple. On the weekend, you're in a little group. You're listening to the conversation. Pick somebody in the group and ask the question. You know, clearly you're an interesting person. You must have done some pretty cool things in your life. Tell me about something that you've done that you're particularly proud of. And you'll be surprised at some of the stories you get. I've done this presentation occasionally with Bob Lambert, and if any of you know Bob Lambert, I think Kathy, you probably do. Yeah, you certainly do. Bob Lambert's done the presentation with me, so he knows the story. He's read the book. In fact, I learned about Daniel Kahneman from his late partner, Dan Kreitzer. So Bob's very familiar with the strategy. So Bob and I are at breakfast. We're having breakfast one day, and he says, we had a nice conversation. He says, "Listen, I've got to run. I've got an appointment in about 20 minutes." And I said, "Great. Before you do, I've got one last question." And I was just kidding with him, right? I figured he'll know what I'm up to right away. And so I asked him, "You know, Bob, I've known you for years. You've done some fascinating things. What's the one thing that you've done that you're most proud of?" And he started telling the story. And it was, you will hear marvelous stories when you ask this question, but it was a marvelous story. And he was completely into it. And after about half an hour, he goes, "Oh, hold on a second." He picks up his phone, and he calls the person he's supposed to already be at and says, "Listen, I'm running late. It'll probably be another 20 minutes or so before I get there." 45 minutes later, he leaves the table, right? Completely sucked in by the question. It is that powerful of a question. And I got to tell you, if you ever ask that question of Bob Lambert, you're going to get a great story, right? So at any rate, whatever you do, don't interrupt. So imagine 4 or 5 of you are standing around, and one of the members of the group is telling a story what are you doing? Listening. No, you're pretending to listen because you're dying for them to finish their story, because guess what? You've got a better one, right? We're competitive storytellers. We can't wait to tell our story. It's just how we're wired, right? When you ask this question, shut that down, right? This is their moment. And when they're done with the story, that's when you exit, right? So, oh, I'm so glad I asked this question. That was really, that's marvelous. And leave it at that, right? You can bring it up to them later on. So I use this example because in the church that we've been affiliated with, there's a group that goes down to Kenya, and they build schools for orphanages. And so you ask somebody the question, and they start telling you the story of going to Kenya and working on building the school. It was hot, sweaty, bugs were everywhere. You were hauling these heavy cinder blocks and putting them in. It was arduous work, but you know what? It felt great. And when we were done, we had built this schoolhouse, right? Guess what? 6 weeks ago, you were in Kenya building a schoolhouse for an orphanage. What are you dying to do? Well, you're dying to tell that story. Don't. This is their moment. Let them have it. Somewhere down the road, you'll get to tell that story to them as well. Hold on to it. Don't take anything away from their moment. That's what builds the relationship. And it creates a bond. So that's it. Any questions?
When you're asking that MP question, you mentioned it was important to make sure it was about work, so they don't talk about family or something else. Is it important that they tell you about at the company for which you're interviewing?
Right. So good question. Is it important that they answer the question about the company where you're interviewing? No. No, because what you're really trying to do is cause a big peak in their brain. So they can really talk about anything. Once they get started, you'll just go with the flow. Plus, it may be that they've only been there 3 weeks, right? So you don't expect that they'll answer that question that way.
The peak interview, can you utilize that when you're not in a one-on-one situation?
Yes, so very commonly there are panel interviews, right? And so you want to ask this question because it's powerful, but you want to try and figure out who do you ask it of. Well, you ask it of the decision maker, providing you can figure out who the decision maker is, right? If you can't, then pick the most alpha personality in the room. Here's the problem with a panel. If you ask this question of somebody and they're going to tell a story about something in that company, two things are going to be on their mind. One, everybody's already heard this story, probably a number of times. And two, you have to worry that they're going to think you're taking more credit than you deserve for the outcome, right? The alpha personality isn't going to care about that, right? They're going to tell the story. And chances are they'll be influential in the decision making. They'll speak up. So if you don't know who the decision maker is, pick the most alpha personality in the room. Better to do it on a one-on-one environment.
I was in a reverse role where I was interviewing someone, and they asked that question about, what's your expectations of the ideal candidate, and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of felt tricked. I felt like they were wanting me to share all these high points I was looking for so they could then maneuver their experience to cover all those, versus letting them freely share their experiences, their accomplishments, and so on, and see if they met that criteria.
Okay.
In other words, they kind of form-fitted, whether those were true accomplishments or experiences, they form-fitted it into my expectations.
Right.
And I kind of felt a little tricked, I guess.
Okay, so the question is, the bonus question was asked about the ideal candidate, which is not the way to ask it, but you felt a little tricked because you thought they were going to use whatever you revealed to tailor their answers then to match what your expectation was. And one of the things that you do is you ask this question towards the end of the interview. So you've already answered all their questions. It's now towards the end of the interview, so it's not really going to set you up to answer questions going forward. Plus, you want to make sure that you don't ask it that way. You don't want to ask it, imagine it's the end of the year, you've hired the ideal candidate, what have they done? You want to say, imagine you hired me, it's the end of the year, what have I done? Because you want them to put you in that role. And sort of a further question is, what if the hiring managers read the peak interview, right? Then one, they should be flattered that the person that's interviewing with them is well prepared, right? And if they're not, they're not. You know, you can't win every battle. One of the things about any of this stuff, so psychological studies are based on behavior, observed behavior. And what makes the psychology a little powerful is that they can repeat the experiment with the same outcome, right? That's what science is all about. However, in any of these experiments, not 100% of the people chose chocolate cake, right? There were some that didn't. And every time you do it, there's some that don't. So it doesn't work on 100% of people, but it will work on the majority of people, and it works reliably enough that it's worth using.
And I guess this person wasn't as sincere. I think if you're more sincere on how you ask some of these questions
Right.
to get answers from the interviewer, this person kind of was like, you know, okay, here's the 5 key points for him, and he asked the question very early in the interview so that he could tailor his speech back to
Right.
me, covering all those 5 key points that I
Yeah, so performance in the interview is something that you actually want to be as genuine as you can be. Be who you are, because that's who you're going to be from the first day you step onto the job. So you want them to see who you are. So I would encourage you not to try and be somebody you're not. You want to be well prepared. You want to do the research on the company, read CEO speeches if you can, find out everything you can about the company. Use questions to reveal that you know something about the company, that you've done this research. All of those things are important, but be genuine. Absolutely be genuine. And if you can't ask this question genuinely, don't, right?
Right.
I want. In the section where you had the success thing, there was one of the bullet points was about something you had failed, and then at the end it was a beat you were ashamed of. A little uncomfortable with ashamed of. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what?
Sure. So these were just sample questions out of the 64 toughest interview questions, and I picked them, and in the book I've got answers that I use for them. The trick with answering a question in the interview is the answer has to be a little bit satisfactory, but doesn't actually have to answer the question exactly that way. So my ashamed story, and I'll try and remember it, sort of tell it quickly. I worked for Diners Club International, and I ran global operations for the company, and that caused me to travel a lot. And one of my responsibilities was wherever there was a new franchisee, so it was a franchise company, wherever there was a new franchisee, I was the guy responsible for getting them set up. We had not had a franchise in Pakistan for many years, mostly because of the political situation there. The family that had owned the franchise before had escaped to Switzerland first, and then later to London. They started a bank in Switzerland, got filthy rich. They did nothing with the Diners Club franchise for many years, and they finally sold it. The new owners then started to rejuvenate the franchise. It was a startup, and so I was the point person for that. And I ended up flying. I was doing an around-the-world trip, and I thought I'll stop in Karachi to meet these people face to face and help them out. And so I landed in Karachi. They took me to the office right away, worked all through the day, and then they took me to the hotel in the evening. They said, listen, we're having an event, a kickoff event in your hotel this evening, and we'd love it if you'd come. I said, great, I will. So wear a suit. I said, okay. And there'll probably be a reporter there from the local newspaper who will interview you, so would you be willing to do that? I said, sure. So I was expecting to go into a room like this, where we were having a little kickoff event for this little company. But they had opened up the ballroom. It was as big as it could possibly be. Big stage, huge crowd. I was interviewed by a couple of newspapers and a couple of television stations. And then there was a presentation, and I was taken up onto the stage. There were a bunch of chairs in the back, and I sat down in one of the chairs. And speeches started. And the speeches were all in Urdu, which I happen not to speak. And so I'm there in the audience, on the stage, listening to the speeches. And whenever there was applause, I applaud. Now, I've always been an enthusiastic applauder, so I'm clapping like crazy. Then the last speaker was the mayor of Karachi. And they brought up this bouquet thing, and they gave it to him. And then he turned around and he looked at me, and he called me up, and he gave me this bouquet, said some things in Urdu. I shook his hand, completely mystified about what was going on. Later on, I'm down in the crowd, walking around, And this guy comes up to me, he says, I'm the information officer for the US Embassy, and I just wanted to have a word with you. I said, sure. He says, listen, I think you owe your host an apology. I said, really? Why? He said, well, because I think you embarrassed him. What did I do? He says, well, the speeches were all about kicking off the business and how they couldn't have done it if you hadn't been there. If you hadn't answered the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning in Chicago to help them with some problem, that you hadn't guided them through the systems purchase process, through the customer service development, all those things that you did to get them up and running. And every time they said something nice about you, you applauded like crazy. He says, I think you should go and apologize to your host. So I went over to my host and I said, listen, I'm really sorry. I didn't know what the speeches were about. I'm told that they were talking about stuff that we did together and that I was applauding like crazy. If I embarrassed you, I really am sincerely apologetic. And he says, oh, no, don't worry about it. He says, we knew you didn't speak Urdu. It's perfectly fine. It's about 5 years later. I'm in London, and he's in London. I'm having a program in London. And he and I go out to dinner. And we're at dinner, and he says, listen, I have to tell you something. He says, whenever we get together and somebody talks about the launch party, we always talk about you up there on the stage applauding like crazy whenever we're talking about you, and we laugh and laugh and laugh about it. And so I was a little ashamed about that. Right? So there's an answer to the question that doesn't answer the question at all. Right? It's not expected. But it reveals a lot of competencies, right? And that's what you want your story to do. So what are my competencies? One, I'm very customer focused. I'm not afraid to go into an alien situation. I'm not afraid to talk to the press, right? I'm not afraid to be up on stage. I'm not afraid to be myself. I can laugh at myself. So these are all things that you want your story to bring out. All right, great. Thank you. Oh, if anybody wants a book, I've got them.